Hi, thank you everybody, and welcome to the Corcentric webinar for June, Redefining P2P in the Digital Era. This month, Corcentric is teaming with the Hackett group, and we're looking forward to hearing all the information that's coming. If you have any questions, on the right-hand side, you'll see a QA panel. Just simply input your question there, and from there, we'll be able to try and answer your question during the webinar. If not, we will be sure to get back to you as quickly as possible. Now, we're joined today by our speakers. First, we have Amy Fong, who's Principal and Senior Advisor from the Hackett Group. And then we've got Dan Andrew, Corcentric Senior Vice President of Sales. And from here, Dan, I'm going to turn it over to you and let you do a little introduction for Corcentric.
Thanks, Mike, and thanks for joining us for today. Delighted to share some information with you. Just to give our audience a little bit of information about Corcentric, we process about $38 billion in transaction value. We've been doing that since 1996. For over 6,000 clients, 14 million transactions, and we're very happy that our clients stay with us for almost forever with a very high customer retention rate. At this point, I think I'm going to turn it back over to Amy from the Hackett Group that's going to lead us through the webinar today.
Great. Thanks so much, Dan and Michael. I am happy to be here today. For those of you not familiar with the Hackett Group, we're a global benchmarking advisory and operations firm. We've been measuring companies for a long time now, and the area where I am in our advisory program, we really focus on source to pay and helping organizations get to world class. So in that top right corner of effectiveness and efficiency. And we do quite a bit of primary research. I'm going to share a bit on that today. We're going to talk about the digital imperative in purchase to pay and how that requires a stakeholder-centric approach. We'll also talk about what digital really means for P2P. I find a lot of people still kind of struggle with it. It's a bit of a buzzword these days, but I want to talk really pragmatically about what the things are that we need to do as P2P professionals to keep up in this world and keep our organizations competitive. We'll talk about some of the key capability areas that we see people focusing on right now. The four that I'm going to focus on today are user experience, digital technology, smart automation, and talent. Hopefully those are top of mind for many of you. And then we'll talk a little bit about inspiring the change and what we need to do as leaders to be successful. So when we look at what digital transformation really is and the external landscape, the idea here is that we live in a world where competition is intensifying. There's quite a bit of disruptive innovation. I think many organizations have felt these kind of pressures from the external environment, whether it be, we used to use the example of like Uber taking over the taxi industry, right? But I think in almost every industry, there's something going on commercially that's making us look a little bit differently, or making us, keeping us on our toes in the way that we work with our customers. There's also different business expectations. Business expectations have certainly increased in terms of compliance, in terms of innovation leadership, partner relationships, agility, which we'll talk about in a minute, cost leadership, and I would say delighting customers kind of being at the forefront of that. We really believe at Hackett, and my experience in working with a couple hundred companies in our advisory programs has shown me that it's really important to be customer-centric, and there's a variety of different ways we can do that, different tools organizations are using to be customer-centric, but we all have a requirement, whether we're external customer-focused or just facing our internal customers, to think about things from the external view and the customer view. And to get there, we really enable our business and our processes with digital operations and digital insights. And so you see a variety of different tools down here and emerging technologies. We'll talk a little bit about smart automation today, which is kind of the right side of this digital operations box. And we'll also talk about digital insights and information. Using information to our advantage to be proactive and predictive is increasingly important to be competitive. So the most advantageous strategies that we see are really to enable agile operations. And I have some slides where we look at the life cycle of companies on the S&P 500, and it has shrunk significantly. It used to be about 30 years that companies would be, kind of rise and fall in their life cycle and their product life cycle. Now it's about 10 or 15. It's really, really shrunk in the last few years. And that's not just tech companies. That's across all industries, including consumer products and industrials and anywhere you look. So being in a certain industry doesn't necessarily protect you from these digital impacts and the outside competition and the rate of change that's happening. When we think about what agility really is, it's the ability to adapt and anticipate and swiftly respond to changes in the business environment. So we kind of view it as three things: ability to identify and make and implement decisions quickly, to detect and rapidly respond to changes, and to maintain or improve cost levels under volatile business conditions. Dan, I'm going to pause for a second and ask you if you've seen any examples of external influences that cause a lot of change like this and require agility.
I have, Amy, yes, and thanks for asking. So as we know, the rate of change, it's becoming more geometric. I mean, I've seen things that used to take 6 months now take 6 days or less. And I think the influence largely is driven by the outside, the customer, who shares the request externally. And then we as providers listen to those outside influences to make some changes and adapt. I'll give you one example. We had a solution where we were working with a customer, and what we had proposed, it wasn't exactly what they wanted. It was pretty close, but they needed some adjustments that was really designed for their business. And so what happened was, as you think about what the customer wants, we were able to kind of mock up some solutions right during the meeting and kind of prescribe a way that really satisfied the request of the client, take it back and quickly develop a solution. I think we're going to continue to see more of that. I think it's going to move even closer towards real time as we collaborate directly with the customer. And specifically, you're going to create an outcome that is filled with the whole agile environment.
Thanks, Dan. That's really helpful.
Back over to you, Amy.
Great. Thank you. So let me talk for just a moment about what this digital opportunity or digital business strategy means to purchase to pay. I think most of the people on the phone today come from probably a purchase to pay background. You're either a procurement person or a finance person or something in between, hopefully an end-to-end process owner that's looking at the process across the functional silos. The way we view this is that we're aligned to the business and the key functions. So your organization at the top level should have a digital business strategy, or let's just call it a business strategy these days. And then within that, each function has a strategy as well. When we think about the capabilities we need in P2P, it's really built on a foundation of digital intelligence, analytics-driven business insights, the information that we have. And P2P generates quite a bit of information that enables the rest of the business. So our supplier information, our purchasing information, our spend analysis, our item and catalog information, right? It's payment data, working capital, so tons of content that can drive decisions and is necessary to be forward-looking. In other parts, so say the sourcing organization or our treasurer, they rely on that information. On top of that, we need to build capabilities. And the capabilities really focus on 4 areas: digital customer engagement and personalization. So the way that we work with our internal customers, the way that we serve our requisitioners, for instance, in the purchasing process, or our support inquiries in the AP process for people looking for invoice information or payment information. The digital service and process optimization, that's really thinking about what we are going to serve or offer to our customers and how we're going to optimize our internal processes to be as efficient and effective as possible. Also, the digital ecosystem of network solutions. So we are sitting right in between our external supply base and our internal customers, and we need to think about what that network looks like. I've been saying lately that I don't think process automation alone is enough. We really need to start outside in, and we need to look at how we're connecting externally to share information, and that's a big part of what makes a P2P process effective and valuable. Then also digital compliance. So a big part of the role we play is in adhering to internal and external compliance, and we need to get more efficient at doing that. We need to do that electronically and take the manual steps out of the process. And then, of course, we partner with IT. We enable ourselves with the capabilities of our partner organizations internally. Beyond just the technology, though, I always feel like I need to remind people that digital is not about technology. It's also about new ways of doing things, starting with, these emerging technologies and enabling things from by looking externally in or outside in, starting with customer needs and then designing new ways to engage. And it also requires a different culture to be really successful. We need to have this fast-fail philosophy. The companies that I know that are doing digital really well have a culture where they can go out and they can maybe adopt 5 or 6 different RPA providers, try them out in various pilots. They know they're not all going to be successful, but those that aren't, they discard and they move on and they learn from it. And the ones that work, they improve and they build upon. And that kind of risk-taking and lack of adversity towards risk, I think, is not really common in many of our cultures. So I think it's really important at the top to start shifting that culture and pushing people to think outside the box and embrace the velocity of change. We're not thinking of this as discrete projects anymore. It really has to be continuous transformation. Sorry, just a delay there. So I'm going to talk about those 4 points I mentioned earlier. The first one I want to talk about is user experience. And we have seen P2P organizations really take some significant steps to improve the customer experience for their shoppers, their buyers, and for their suppliers. And people sometimes don't view it this way, but I view suppliers as customers as well. We want to be the customer of choice for our suppliers. That brings us the best innovation. It brings us the best service levels. We also want to make sure that we're easy to do business with. And we want to get the best choice of suppliers that we can. So making life easier for suppliers and taking costs out of their process in the way they deal with us benefits the whole ecosystem. So some of the things that people said they're doing most commonly when we surveyed their key issues last year was deploying and enhancing technology platforms, specifically easier to use technology platforms than we've had in the past. Those that are easy to onboard and those that are easy for the user. Streamlining policies and procedures. And this is an interesting one. I like to think about how, in the last few years, we've seen this sudden resurgence of questions around things like delegation of authority policy, which is, every company's had a spending policy for a long time usually, but they're starting to look at those again. And I really think the technology kind of drives that. As you start to automate a process, you start to look at, does this make sense the way we're doing it? Should we take steps out? Can we put levels, a little bit higher? Do we need to change the way we process and pass things around internally? So policy couples with technology in many cases. Also investing in change management skills and expertise so P2P teams can really drive this change with their stakeholders. And a lot of training and community education going on. And there's obviously a bunch of other things on here as well that I think are worth noting. One thing that we've seen that I found particularly interesting is the shift in terms of who has the most influential voice in selecting technology, specifically across the source-to-pay suites. In the past, people said that it was usually IT that was looking at what's the best technology for integration, followed by the business looking for feature function, and then way at the end was ease of use from the customer. What we see today and in the future is that the business is looking at feature function, and then the customer is looking at ease of use. And look how much that customer ease of use has increased. That's gone significantly up to about 60%, saying that's a critical from, what was it, 15, 16% before. So really huge shift in focus on the customer. IT has kind of dropped to the bottom, and I don't think it's because we don't care about IT. We certainly should not be working around them. But the types of technology we're working with today, with cloud software as well as much easier to integrate platforms, means that technology integration is less of a challenge than it used to be. It's less of a hurdle. So it's no longer the number one concern, and that's great. I think this is all very good for the market and good for the consumer, or the commercial customer, in terms of selecting things. And Dan, I think this is sort of an interesting slide. Have you seen anything like representing this or anything related to this in your experience?
Yeah, I think this information that you're providing, there's so much data and examples of what you're providing. It's amazing, all the information that's here. It's great. And I think when I look at this and I see that in the past, I agree with this slide, because I think in the past IT was, a huge driver, and a lot of it was because of capabilities. And today, when we look at our model, it's more of the business model and the customer that's really driving the opportunities. I'll give you an example, kind of just to share one from years ago. I worked with a very large drug chain, and at the time their systems were connected where, as a consumer, you could go into any one of their retail outlets and be able to get your prescription, which that was a differentiator at the time. Today, everybody has that. All the discount drug chains have those systems connected. The consumer today doesn't consider that a differentiator. They want information on mobile. And so they'll drive it to the next, area where they're able to receive the information, because as the consumer, they're helping drive the business decision. And then IT is really shifting more to a service model where they're not necessarily the driver, like in your example. In years past, sometimes when IT was kind of the area where you'd have to have some changes, it was like having major surgery, sometimes asking for additional changes, where today it's much more rapid to define. And by the way, that's the difference between major and minor surgery, right? Minor surgery is when it's on everybody else, and major surgery is when it's on you. But the difference here is that IT is now in a service model. After they're responding quicker, and the business is really driving that, because again, the customer and the business, when they line up the opportunities, IT with that service function is able to provide those requirements for the business in a faster and better model. And that's really, it's been a good shift, and I think it's one that we'll continue to see.
Yeah.
I'll turn it back over to you, Amy.
Thanks, Dan. That's a great example. I mean, for all of us as consumers, it's great. And for us as business users, it's great as well. I think the competition in the marketplace and the technology development really benefits everyone. But it can be a tough shift if you're right in the middle of it. So I'm going to start talking a little bit more about digital technologies and what we see today. This is our view of really what I call core source-to-pay process automation. This starts with sourcing and goes all the way to payment, so it's upstream and downstream. I know we're talking about P2P today, but I feel these are all interconnected, and we need to be thinking about the whole source-to-pay ecosystem to truly optimize. And I call this core automation because essentially before you get to any emerging technologies, you really need to have everything electronic. You've got to have your transactions at a very high level of automation, 90 to 95%. Most companies are very far away from that. When we look at something like e-invoicing or purchase requisitions or POs going to suppliers, you also need to have all of your data, your information, as I say, complete and correct, meaning that, your master data is both complete and it's visible, complete, accurate, and visible. And then these emerging technologies really build on top of this. When we look at our companies, the companies in our benchmark, those that have automated these core processes have had significantly better outcomes. So 66% higher savings, 26% fewer clerical people, in clerical versus, professional roles versus managerial roles. So people that are really more making decisions and driving activities versus just inputting data. 71% lower order processing costs. That is significant, right? It's much cheaper to just place an order and pay a supplier, as well as more likely to be viewed as a valuable business partner. So it is key to have this core process automation in place before you really can move and progress down the path of digital transformation. If you're doing manual processes, your ability to increase value is limited. And what I see in many organizations is kind of this two-speed in a bad way method or process where we've automated half our transactions and half of our suppliers are sending things electronically, but the rest are still manual. So we have a paper process and an electronic process in parallel. And that's not a way to be long-term. Obviously, that's a middle step, but we need to push it beyond that to 100% automation wherever we can. When we look at this, though, with kind of the broader and digital lens on, we see those top core automation pieces, and this row on the top hasn't changed. Obviously, those integrate with all of your enterprise systems, and these enterprise systems may be changing right now as well, right? ERP systems are going in the cloud. Many companies are going through large ERP upgrades as they cycle from an older system to a newer cloud-based platform. PLM systems, asset management, warehouse management. Depending on your industry, you may have a much longer list of these. On top of that, though, we're building in capabilities with these emerging technologies. And all of these are at different maturity levels. So we look at robotic process automation that we're going to talk more about in a minute. That's actually been around for quite a while. It's just gotten to the place in the last 4+ years where it's really become more accessible and more cost effective and widely available and implemented. And so we'll talk about that in a moment. Other things here, we're starting to see augmented reality for sourcing, for instance, and Internet of Things in warehousing, and in the ordering process, even where we see people placing orders in a lab by speaking into an Alexa-like device, right? Really interesting stuff that's happening that just changes the way our users interface with us. Intelligent data capture is kind of more part of process automation at this point, or more part of smart automation and cognitive, and we'll talk about where we are on those in a moment. Blockchain as well. Blockchain has a lot of potential. It's much earlier in the development curve, and I'm sure people are interested in learning about that if you haven't already, but it's kind of a let's watch it develop for most organizations right now. We also see procurement tools or source-to-pay technologies really emerging as well, some of which are building on these technologies. So category cockpits and tools that category or even budget owners can use to view their supply base and view all the market intelligence that they need. Savings dashboards, supplier networks, portals, and marketplaces have evolved quite a bit, and especially relevant to the P2P process or financial supply chain tools. So things enabling dynamic discounting and financial supply chain financing, and there's a million variations out there of the way supply chain financing can work, but essentially tools that enable us to have various options to control our working capital in different ways than we could before. And all of that really relies on automation. So if you're dealing with paper invoices, these financial supply chain tools are probably not going to be as useful for you or as easy to implement. Once you're in this automated process, these tools kind of layer on top, and it may be a feature function that you're adding into your process. Along with other, when we look at the emerging technologies and the impact we expect them to have, the trends that we saw right now are having the greatest expected impact on the job, and people said are expected to impact the most in the next 10 years are smart automation or artificial intelligence, machine learning and cognitive computing, digitization of B2B connections and transactions, advanced analytics, and robotic process automation. Dan, any of these you'd like to comment on while we're here?
I would. Each one of these has a great impact. And when you mentioned a couple of slides earlier, I think one of the staggering numbers that I saw was a 71% lower processing costs. I mean, that's amazing. That's a significant difference. And I would pick out one here today. I'll talk just a comment about the digitization of B2B connections and transactions, because having that high level of automation, like you talked about, that really is a great way to differentiate your organization from your competitors. And so I'll share an example for you. I worked with a large manufacturer, and what they did is they were really focused on this whole B2B connection and transactions, mostly to achieve really what you talked about with the lower processing costs. And what they did is they went back and they said, really, let's try to get 100% of the straight-through process, because at the end of the day, that's the goal. And so coupling their solution with supply chain finance and other opportunities, what they did is they started with a whole e-procurement where they electronically process an order, and they worked with their suppliers who could electronically acknowledge it, and then they bundled in an electronic receipt, and then they would make sure they processed the invoice electronically. They would pay the supplier electronically, provide electronic remittance information, and then take the bank reconciliation data from their financial institution and then reconcile it back into the organization. So really, from a start to finish environment, that's an example of a company that really created the whole straight-through processing and the impact on labor. And I think Amy's going to talk about this a little later, but just the impact on labor, it was almost like a 50-to-1 ratio in terms of performance, which, you know, gives the opportunity for team members to maybe look at new areas where they can contribute, such as maybe they're going to do some analysis, and the data provides, the analysis allows better decision making, and it provides better jobs and better satisfaction. And it's not a way to necessarily eliminate people, it's a way to elevate the careers and have them contribute at an even greater level in the organization. So if you can achieve that digitization component, I think it really opens up a whole world of opportunity when you streamline, process your organization from the user experience all the way through developing the talent within your organization. I'll turn it back to you, Amy.
Yeah. Thanks, Dan. That's really interesting. That idea of straight-through processing, you know, I do know a number of companies that are measuring that now. I also know many that don't have the capabilities to measure that yet. So I think it's a great metric, and it's a great way to look at how many of our orders actually went all the way through the process and how many transactions across the board, not just one-off in each step. So let me talk a little bit more about robotic process automation. And, you know, the way we've talked about this has changed recently. We tend to talk about smart automation as this bundle of different technologies. And honestly, the way we've talked about RPA, I've watched it evolve just in, you know, the last 2 to 3 or 4 years, both because of the way people have implemented and used it, and because of the way the technology has evolved. And it's still fairly fast moving, and that's what's kind of fun about being in this space in 2019, 2020, that all of these technologies are developing under our eyes. So I think it's important, even if you're not using this or you're not ready for it, to be aware of what's happening in the marketplace and where technologies can be applied potentially, so that as they mature, as they get embedded into the platforms you're using, you have the potential to leverage the value. We should always be looking for opportunities in the continuous improvement, you know, mentality. So we define smart automation as the optimization of execution of transactional knowledge-based and decisioning work through the deployment of robotic process automation, intelligent data capture, and cognitive automation technologies. So if you look at RPA, it's really about mimicking human actions. Intelligent data capture is about mimicking human interpretation. So think of something that is going to, you know, capture data. It could be the old school OCR, of the optical character recognition, that many of us are using and are still using. There's nothing wrong with OCR necessarily. Or it could be a chatbot that you chat with when you're looking up. You know, when I have a question for any of my service providers, I tend to use that online chat. Often it's a bot, sometimes it's not. But it is a way of capturing data. Or, you know, we mentioned Alexa earlier, and verbal kind of commands, voice commands, but any way to mimic human interpretation. Cognitive automation really augments human intelligence. So that's more of the knowledge and decisioning work that is being replicated. So these have different places. They play different roles in source to pay. And I want to talk a little bit more about, what some of the key features of RPA is specifically, because I think when we talk about what's out there, what's well developed, and what's available, specifically for P2P, there's quite a few use cases for RPA. So RPA really mimics human actions. We often refer to it as eliminating the swivel chair tasks, right? So when somebody's going from one system to another, clerically, just to transfer data, usually that can be automated out. Non-integrated and rapid, meaning it doesn't require deep integration into an ERP or into a workflow, and it'll operate on your existing applications. So, that significantly changes the game compared to having to integrate a lot of applications to an ERP or to existing legacy software. A lot of industries have existing systems that they can't just tear out, or they're not ready to tear out. RPA benefits quite a bit there. It's scalable. You can start small and you can add complexity and add functionality. Works best on rule-based tasks. So a lot of people say, RPA is just Excel macros on steroids. And in this sense, they are. I think the major differentiators is that you're going across different platforms and often, outside of one application. It requires digital feeds, and I want to go back to that information part I talked about earlier. If you're doing things on paper, your robots can't see them, right? You have to first capture that information and put it into a digital format that's hopefully accurate, hopefully complete and correct. So you do require digital data that is in digital format. It's also relatively cheap and quick. So compared to a lot of the IT activities that we did in the past, RPA can go in fairly inexpensively, and then it can scale up. We typically think of RPA as business-driven and owned and operated with close collaboration with IT. So it's easy enough that once you get somebody trained up on it in the business, they can work on it with fairly independently. When we talk about a robot and what that means in practice, it's clearly not a robot like the one in the pictures here that we all saw and we see in the movies and still see pictures of a lot. It's a software virtual script running some type of automated sequence of steps, either assisted or unassisted. So think of virtual workers, and the client usually licenses the number it needs to get the work done. They carry out a range of different activities that are defined by the client, and they're usually broken into reusable components. So if you think of an activity example, as they log in, they enter data into screen X and system A, then they read the data Y from website 123, they monitor email inbox for XYZ PDF, then they compare files and send a report to a user. Right, so those are all different robotic scripts that are kind of reusable components that can be combined to finish a process, essentially, or go through several steps in a process. The robot's work is scheduled and it's monitored by some kind of command center tool and by expert users that are, that understand how to set up the robots, how to monitor them, often called an orchestrator, or we use that term. So essentially, that for those of you that this is not a familiar term for, that's really what RPA is. Again, if you knew how to write Excel macros a while back, it's kind of building on that concept, but in a more complex and beneficial way. When we look at RPA in the P2P process, we see that it's being implemented across various steps, most heavily in requisitioning, supplier data management, and invoice processing. So the chevrons we have here are really the way we view the P2P process. You start with purchasing ops and then several steps of accounts payable. And then there's a few other steps that aren't necessarily in line, but P-card management, analytics, travel and expense processing, audit, and reporting. Certainly, there's some that are higher use than others. There's certain traits and characteristics of the process that make robotic process automation more appropriate. For instance, it needs to be something that's repeatable, that doesn't have a lot of variation. It needs to be in systems that are fairly stable. You tend to want to use this when you have a system that's going to be in place for a while. But I think this data sort of helps to look for where the right places are to start to consider this. And if you're working with any RPA provider, they can help assess this as well. I want to jump now into the last portion of the 4 things I talked about. Anytime we talk about robots, I feel like we have to talk about people too, and often there's a lot of nervousness around this. So we have to look at the talent change that's happening in this digital environment. And when we look at the skills that are most likely to be most, valued and important going forward, this is really across all of source to pay. There's a variety of things that I think help us to be more agile and help us to be a trusted business advisor. Things like data analysis and modeling. So we have all of this information. So, we're taking ourselves out, hopefully, with a lot of the digital tools available, taking ourselves out of that day-to-day transactional process. We can use that information to process and extract and make actionable plans, right? Bring visually the trends that are happening, forward-looking information that then we can translate into decisions and help ourselves or others in the organization make more, better decisions, more actionable plans. I think that couples well with some of the other skills here, like business acumen. Business acumen is understanding, if I do this, this is how it affects the business. And a lot of the automation and technology means that we can't be too deep into a small task-based silo. We need to rise ourselves up and look across the organization and understand how what we do fits in. Things like savings and financial analysis and understanding risk and managing risk in the supply base, and risk hits the supply base in a lot of different places. Some of those activities or those touch points are very visible in the P2P process. Others might be earlier upstream. Creativity and innovation and agility and change orientation. So these tend to be how we work and more out of, I would say, temperament traits. So being the type of person that welcomes change and that gets comfortable with shifting priorities and is able to deal with ambiguity, that really enables people to work in this new environment and to excel. So I've used this slide, and I've actually done presentations just about these with procurement and P2P people on how to kind of develop yourself and build these skills. I think it's important for all of us, regardless of our role, to think about how we're continuously evolving in areas that are going to benefit us in the future. And there's a lot of resources that are more and more available, especially online training and things like that, that can help you become familiar with some of this. So, I've actually seen some really interesting things just on like LinkedIn Learning and some of the what we call MOOCs out there, the massive online education sites, to help build these skills. I think it's also important as leaders to look at how we're developing these skills in our teams. We spend a lot of time working on competency assessing and building out development plans for individuals so that they feel that they are building up these kind of capabilities. Or others, this is obviously not a complete list. We list out about 60 skills and knowledge areas. These are just the ones that tie in most with the digitally enabled workforce. On that note, I think there's often the question of, what will the efficiency look like? How will that affect FTEs? I like to look at this, and I don't want anyone to freak out at these numbers. We've done some analysis that look at some of the productivity gains from smart automation. I do not look at this as eliminating FTEs. I look at it as enhancing the service we can deliver and shifting people around and shifting the skills. So if we think about where activities are going to be affected by smart automation, it really hits across 3 areas: structured work, knowledge work, and interaction work. And I think what we need to think about is how do we cover more with our capabilities. So structured work is kind of your, prescribed work, rules, methods, and scripts. Accounts payable, PO processing, a lot of that falls into this. How are we going to use data capture, validation, and research to free up our resources there? things like standard inquiry responses, right? A lot of these tasks and a lot of the ways RPA or other tools affect those types of structured work are by getting a lot of the noise and repetitive activity out of it. That I can tell you, frankly, most people coming out of school now and doing things in a P2P environment don't really want to be doing continuous, data entry and answering the same inquiry response 1,000 times a week. They're looking for ways to get away from that and do things more value add. So I think the technology enables us to retain workforce. It's interesting how many companies I'm talking to that they say automation helped us to get, to retain our good talent, so they didn't get bored with the work and move on in some of these structured processes. When we think about knowledge work, it's often around the acquisition or application of knowledge. And a lot of this happens in sourcing execution and category management. I think there's some of this in the P2P process as well, interpreting data, doing analysis, decision making. Certainly those of us in P2P that are gathering information or producing information have a role to play here, and making sure that we're getting, we're understanding where data is coming from and how it should be interpreted is incredibly important, and that's a value add versus we look at a metric of how much time is spent gathering data versus how much time is spent analyzing it. And you really want to shift your time from data gathering into data analyzing. That adds a lot more value, obviously, to the process. And frankly, wouldn't we all be rather be on that former activity? And then finally, interaction work. So this is the non-scripted interaction with people. A lot of us, and I believe that robotics and technology is not going to necessarily replace the interaction and the relationship building that we have between suppliers, between stakeholders. Innovation comes from creativity. When we look at these skills on the last slide, the supplier relationship management, the supplier management, innovation, creativity, those are hard to replicate, even with the best artificial intelligence. You look at something like Watson, yes, very smart, but does not have the human skills in a non-replicable form and in a non-scripted way. And the best that we will do is by really working together with the technology to be able to optimize. And plenty of futurists believe that, it's the people plus robot combination that's going to make us, that's going to really lead in the future. So when we think about supplier management and stakeholder management, again, a lot of this is about expanding the breadth and the scope of what we can do, because right now we tend to be resource constrained, in fact, in terms of covering all the spend and working with all of our suppliers or all of our top suppliers and working with our top stakeholders. So again, we're using technology, and when we see this kind of FTE reduction, it's really based on what we're currently doing. And there's another way of looking at this. We kind of look at the peers, the current peers, and we look at the world-class companies that we work with. World-class is already more productive than their peers, the peer companies. We think there's some advantage of smart automation, and then there's kind of this digital world-class for those that are in the world-class implementing the most leading emerging technologies. For peers that are starting out higher, there's a huge opportunity in technology optimization. So you see an even bigger opportunity here from optimizing with technology and smart automation. Essentially, just to sum this up, because I know a lot of people look at this and get nervous about, wow, you're just talking about getting rid of a lot of people. The way we really view this is that smart automation is going to free up a lot of the FTEs or the transactional work, but also enhance productivity and reach of the interactive and the knowledge work that we do. So it shouldn't be about how can I look at my workforce and reduce it. It should be about how can I do more with the people I have? How can I put them in higher value adding roles? How can I free up some of the transactional and the routine and really optimize the way we look forward, the way we analyze data, and the value that we're delivering to the business. So with that, I want to just talk a little bit about kind of what the digitally savvy CPO, CFO can do to get started on all of this. I I always think stakeholders first. So we talked about outside looking in, understand your customers and their strategy and their priorities, whether it be budget owners that you're supporting, whether it be requisitioners, whether it be people working with suppliers that are looking for invoicing information, that kind of thing. Supplier managers, there's stakeholders all over the organization. Pilot and learn. So be ready to rapidly evaluate the activities that are suitable for a pilot. Test, learn, and then scale. Demonstrating value always wins, and it's okay to have that kind of fast failure type philosophy. Look at your strategy and roadmap. So go back to the roadmap you already have. Make sure that it has digital integrated into it. If it doesn't, you probably can add more to it or enhance it. Maybe there are steps that can be compressed with newer technologies. If you wrote your roadmap more than 6 months ago, technology has changed, and it's worth taking a new look at it. Education. So I think it's incredibly important to make sure that everybody in the organization understands what new technologies are coming down the pipe, what potential impact they should be, and they should have the freedom and be kind of empowered to think about how those technologies could improve their job and the role that they're doing and the way that they work with their internal customers. This is not one person driving. This should be everybody across the organization thinking about how they continuously improve. Continuous alignment. So it's not a one-time thing. It's going back to your stakeholders ongoing. As you've updated that strategy and making sure you're aligned and you're adjusting to support them, continuously refining. And then finally, know your talent. So assess your talent, be honest, understand the digital talent you need for the new model, and help people build, and this should really be in there. I mentioned competency plans, and we see a lot of kind of internal academies being started. Make sure you're giving your people the opportunity to develop into those roles. This isn't something that's going to be a switch that's flipped on overnight. It is a continuous process, but it is one that we can't escape. And we all within our organizations want to retain strong people. We need to give them a path to be successful. And I believe that's all our role as leaders and as managers, to make sure that we're helping our people to develop in the new environment. Dan, have you seen companies execute on any of these? Anything you'd like to comment on this side? I know there's a lot here.
You're right. There really is a lot here. This is a wonderful slide because you've touched on so many different avenues here. I like the comment that you mentioned earlier, and we've seen clients where their goal really is to shift from data gathering to data analyzing. I mean, that really is a lot of what you were talking about as we focus more on the digital format, getting the information and making good decisions. I'll share an example that I think kind of walks through this because, again, this is a great slide. I really like it. I had a client that was a large distributor, and what they said was they really wanted to get digital, but their focus really was to help their team members do more analysis because there were a lot of decisions that their company needed to make, but they were struggling with spending so much time gathering the data that they couldn't really spend the time analyzing and making the better decisions. So we kind of got together and looked at what they wanted, and they said, well, some unique requirements. Some of our line items are different, our unit of measure. They had, a variety of different requirements that were unique to them. And so what it really required was an opportunity to create a pilot with maybe 25 or so suppliers to really work through the process and figure out, is this something that we can modify and scale to the rest of the organization? So after we did that, we kind of looked at the roadmap and put a program in place, and we piloted it. And then we took the results, as you share with the education, from the suppliers and talked to them, and they said, well, if you could really do 4 or 5 different things, you've covered most of it, but here's a few features that would just make life so much better and more effective for both organizations. And so we did that. And then we went back to the roadmap and said, okay, now that we made these changes, does it look like this is going to align and really achieve the objective? And the answer was yes. So as we continued to align and get the stakeholders in play, we managed to create an offering where we could roll it out to all the suppliers so that they could really take advantage of the whole customer digital environment so that they get the information in their systems. And then what happened was they were able to make better decisions, really, because what they did with their talent is those team members we're able to really analyze the information, which was great. I think one of your comments, really, as you're describing this, as I hear you kind of summarize without saying it, sounds to me like even with all the tools with RPA and AI, which are great productivity helpers, there's really no replacement for the human brain. And that's really the talent pool for us to work through. So I think this slide, I think it's a great model. I think your chart is spot on. And as we kind of come towards the end of our webinars, we're wrapping things up. I think Amy has some great key takeaways on the next slide to kind of just remind us of a lot of the information we talked about today.
Yeah, thanks, Dan. I'm a big fan of this slide as well. I just feel like it captures a lot of the things that aren't necessarily captured on a technology slide, but are really important. And I agree with you. There's no replacement for the human brain. I mean, we are unique in that as a species, right? So I think the technology enables us, it makes us better, and we kind of need to embrace that and figure out how to use it to the best advantage. So with that, I want to wrap up with just a couple takeaways, and these kind of talk across what I shared today, plus a couple other things from our study. I mean, one takeaway, I didn't go through our kind of the timeline of the past studies we've done, but we've really seen a shift from focusing on just standardization and globalization to digital transformation. That's clearly shown in a lot of the data that we have. Transactional efficiency is still important. We definitely need to get our costs down, but more effort really is being spent on effectiveness at this point, and a quantifiable improvement in the customer experience. So, most organizations have already put a lot of effort into streamlining their processes, driving their, cost per order, cost per invoice as low as they can. But really, if you're not effective and you're not delivering a good customer experience, you're still lacking. And that tends to be where the focus is. We've had supplier networks around for a long time. I think there's a huge amount of opportunity still in improving the way we connect with our suppliers and enabling our suppliers on our platforms, in exchanging information digitally, quickly and effectively. And I really believe that when we look at the organization, the P2P organization has P2P, process specifically has an important role to play in information gathering and in information governance to enable advanced analytics across the enterprise. So we have a pretty big practice at Hackett that does enterprise performance management, lots of, planning and budgeting information technologies that the finance organization uses, and they're using data from P2P. If they don't have good data in, they're not going to get good answers out. Same with the sourcing organization, right? And even the sales organization, understanding the cost of goods. So if we can't capture our payment information and our product and supplier and part information accurately, we're really doing a disservice to the rest of the organization. And I don't think we think about that as often as we should in P2P. That point about the customer and the business unit really leading the technology decision-making efforts, I think is very important. I think that that's really shifted in the way that we choose technology. I talked quite a bit about kind of the digital transformation and embracing advanced technologies and complementing our core P2P platforms with tools like RPA or cognitive tools that are kind of layering on top of that core automation. So with that, I'm going to wrap up, and I think we probably have a couple minutes to take some questions if we want to.
Yeah, great information, Amy. Really enjoyed everything that you and Dan had to discuss here. Again, just to remind everybody, the question poll is on your right-hand side. Please feel free to enter any. We did get a couple in here. Dan, I think this one is right up your alley. How should we approach building a technology strategy?
So how should you approach building a technology strategy? Well, I think with a lot of the elements that we talked about here today, looking at your data and what you have and what you don't have, and what your main objectives are for your teams and how you're really trying to gain the efficiencies within your business. I think taking a consultative approach, working with companies like the Hackett Group and Corcentric, who are experts in those areas, many times what companies do is they They jump in, they kind of think about what they're going to do, and then halfway through it, they'll decide, maybe we'll add some resource help. Many times what I've seen is the best companies will invite organizations like the Hackett Group or Corcentric to kind of talk about it in the beginning to help set that framework. And then what happens is they say, oh, I didn't really even realize there were other capabilities that existed beyond what we were looking at. So that really helps to create a roadmap and help companies achieve even more than what they might be able to do on their own.
Great, great. Looks like we have time enough for one more question. Amy, I'm going to hit you with this one because I think you may have scared somebody a little bit. But their question is, should this number FTE numbers decrease concern me personally?
Yeah,
so I think you hit a nerve with somebody there, so I'm gonna throw that one your way.
Yeah, I'm happy to answer that. I mean, I think that I tried to de-emphasize the number part and the FTE part as much as possible. Should it concern us? I mean, I would say that there are probably some people out there that should think about how they are developing those skills. And if we go back to some of those skills of the future, and we go back to that idea of thinking outside of your siloed transactional role and understanding, what technology can do to eliminate a lot of the activities you do, you should be thinking about what other activities you will do to add value. I think that all of us, I mean, it's, in this day and age, need to be constantly improving our skills. And I would say that across any career, any job in pretty much any industry. But I think especially in source to pay or P2P, we need to be thinking about, how do I get better at understanding this technology, comfortable with change? This does not mean that everybody who's doing accounts payable processing is going to be laid off next week. That's simply not the case. Frankly, a lot of that has already happened in the industry as we gained those efficiency gains, as we offshored, as we outsourced, as we automated our core processes. What we're looking at now with digital transformation is piling on more value on top of it. So think about how you as an individual enable that value. Are there gaps in your skills? There's tons of free online training available now that we can help to build up some of this. How do I illustrate that? How do I think about, in my role, again, how do I add value to the bigger process, to the bigger picture? And I think if we're doing that, we're in a much better position. So I don't think these numbers should scare anybody. It's frankly, to me, it's a much slower decline or slower squeezing than we've seen in the past. It's more of an optimization and an expansion of value at this point.
Excellent. And I believe that's the end of the questions that we have for right now. Thank you all for attending our webinar this month. We do have the contact information on the presentation, which we will be getting out to you hopefully within the next hour or two. Thank you, everybody, for attending. Have a great day.
So much.